When times got tough, food became more than just something to eat, it became a story of survival. Imagine the 1930s, when the Great Depression left families with empty wallets and bare cupboards. Or the 1940s, when ration stamps during World War II forced households to stretch every crumb. Out of those struggles came recipes so creative, so resourceful, that they kept generations alive with little more than scraps, weeds, or the cheapest cuts of meat. These weren't gourmet meals. They were humble dishes, built from whatever was on hand, stale bread turned into dessert, weeds from the backyard tossed into salads, or a single hot dog stretched to feed an entire family. Yet for millions of Americans, they were life-saving plates of comfort in a time when hope was scarce. And here's the surprising part, many of these recipes still taste good today. They carry with them the stories of resilience, family unity, and the kind of ingenuity we don't often see in modern kitchens. Every bite is a reminder of how your grandparents, and their parents, pulled through the darkest chapters of American history with courage and creativity simmering in their pots. In this video, we're stepping back in time to rediscover 12 cheap meals that helped families survive hard times. From poor man's meal to water pie, each dish tells its own tale of desperation, survival, and even a little joy at the dinner table. Stick around, because some of these forgotten foods might surprise you, and who knows, you may even want to try one yourself. If you love uncovering the hidden food stories of America's past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join me as we bring these forgotten meals back to life. When you picture a salad today, you probably think of crisp lettuce, colorful vegetables, and a drizzle of dressing. But during the Great Depression, salads often came straight from the yard, not the grocery store. One of the most common meals families turned to was the humble dandelion green salad. It might sound surprising, but in the 1930s, foraging wasn't a trendy pastime, it was survival. Dandelions, considered weeds by many, were actually free food growing right outside the door. Families would gather the young, tender leaves before they turned bitter, wash them carefully, and toss them with simple ingredients like onions, vinegar, or sometimes a slice of bacon if they were lucky. In rural areas especially, this salad meant the difference between going hungry and having something nourishing on the table. Dandelion greens were not just filler, they were packed with vitamins A and C, providing essential nutrition at a time when fresh produce was expensive or simply unavailable. Grandparents often recalled how children were sent out to the fields with baskets, instructed to pick every green they could find before dinner. The ritual became part of daily life, teaching resourcefulness in a way that modern kitchens rarely demand. Though plain by today's standards, this salad carried a sense of pride. It was proof that even in the harshest times, families could find sustenance in the simplest of places. The taste might have been a little bitter, but the memory of eating together, making do, and surviving, that was sweet. So next time you see a patch of dandelions in the yard, remember, for your grandparents, those weeds weren't a nuisance. They were dinner. If you're ready, let's move on to the next forgotten survival dish. When money was scarce and cupboards nearly bare, families in the 1930s turned to one dish that earned a bittersweet nickname, the poor man's meal. It wasn't fancy, but it filled stomachs when little else could. The recipe was simple: cheap potatoes, onions, and the occasional hot dog or sausage, all cooked together in a single pan. Potatoes provided bulk, onions added flavor, and a small amount of meat stretched just far enough to give every bite a hint of richness. Sometimes tomato sauce was mixed in for a touch of comfort. For families trying to feed many mouths with almost nothing, this skillet meal was a lifeline. What made it truly special wasn't the taste, it was the ritual. Kids would help peel potatoes while mothers chopped onions, and fathers returning from long days of searching for work would gather around the stove, waiting for the sizzling smell to fill the room. Even though it was born from struggle, this dish created a sense of togetherness. Many Depression-era families remembered the poor man's meal as both a burden and a blessing. It was a reminder of hardship, but also of resilience, the way ordinary people could stretch a few humble ingredients into something that sustained them through another night. For children who grew up in that era, the memory of this dish stayed with them for life, symbolizing both the bitterness of hard times and the warmth of family unity. In a world where we waste so much food today, the poor man's meal stands as a quiet lesson. Sometimes survival isn't about abundance, but about creativity and gratitude for what little you have. Up next, we'll uncover another Depression classic, one that carried a president's name, Hoover stew. During the Great Depression, meals often carried more than just flavor, they carried stories, even jokes, about the times people lived through. One of the most memorable was a dish with a pointed name, Hoover stew. Named after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the economic collapse, this dish became a symbol of both survival and irony. Families would boil up whatever pasta they had, usually elbow macaroni, then stir it together with canned tomatoes, a handful of beans or corn, and the cheapest meat they could find, often sliced hot dogs. It wasn't pretty, but it stretched a few ingredients into a pot that could feed a crowd. Hoover stew often showed up at soup kitchens and community gatherings, where volunteers cooked huge batches to feed the hungry. The dish was inexpensive, filling, and easy to prepare in large quantities, everything struggling families needed in those desperate years. It became so common that some children who grew up in the 1930s swore they never wanted to see a hot dog again once times improved. Yet for all its simplicity, Hoover stew meant survival. It taught families how to stretch food creatively, turning a can of tomatoes and a couple of hot dogs into dinner for six. For many, it was also a way of sharing. Neighbors often cooked it together, adding whatever scraps they had to make the pot go further. While it may not look glamorous on the plate, Hoover stew carries a powerful message. In times of hardship, food becomes more than nourishment. It becomes a symbol of resilience, humor, and the determination to keep going. Next, we'll move from irony to charity, exploring the story of a Depression-era soup kitchen meal known as Scarface's soup. When the Great Depression hit its darkest days, soup kitchens became lifelines for the hungry. But one of the most talked about kitchens in Chicago had an unusual benefactor, the infamous gangster Al Capone. And the dish that drew thousands to his line each day became known as Scarface's soup. Capone's soup kitchen opened in 1931, serving free meals to the jobless and desperate. The star offering was a simple but hearty tomato-based soup, often bulked up with potatoes, pasta, or a small amount of beef. For people who hadn't eaten in days, a steaming bowl of this soup was nothing short of salvation. Some historians suggest Capone's motives weren't purely charitable. He wanted to polish his public image, but to the men, women, and children who waited in line, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the soup was hot, filling, and free. Scarface's soup reflected the ingenuity of Depression-era cooking. Stretch a little meat, add plenty of vegetables and starch, and make enough to feed the masses. Families who couldn't get to a soup kitchen often recreated it at home, simmering canned tomatoes with whatever scraps they had on hand, sometimes even tossing in pasta or beans to make it last longer. Though its name carried the shadow of crime, this dish symbolized something greater, the way food could restore dignity and hope in times of despair. For many who stood in Capone's line, that bowl of soup wasn't just about hunger. It was a reminder that even in the bleakest times, a simple meal could bring people together and give them strength for another day. Next, we'll move from soup to sweetness with a Depression-era favorite, peanut butter bread. When the Great Depression stripped pantries bare, families leaned on ingredients that were cheap, filling, and versatile. One of the most beloved solutions was peanut butter bread, a humble loaf that brought both nourishment and comfort when luxuries like eggs and milk were out of reach. Peanut butter was a Depression hero. Packed with protein, affordable, and shelf-stable, it became a staple in nearly every American home. But instead of just spreading it on bread, thrifty cooks discovered they could bake it into the bread itself. With a few cups of flour, a little sugar, baking powder, water, and a generous scoop of peanut butter, they created a dense, nutty loaf that was both hearty and satisfying. No eggs, no butter, no milk, just the essentials. This bread quickly became more than food, it was comfort. Mothers baked it to keep their families full, and children remember it as a rare treat during a time when desserts were scarce. Its sweet, earthy flavor paired perfectly with a drizzle of honey or a smear of jam, but it was just as good eaten plain, sliced straight from the oven. The beauty of peanut butter bread was its simplicity. Every ingredient was inexpensive and easy to find, making it a go-to recipe for struggling households. Even decades later, the recipe re-emerged during times of hardship, like the 2020 pandemic, when people once again sought frugal, comforting bakes from the past. For Depression-era families, this loaf carried more than flavor, it carried resilience. Each slice was proof that even in times of scarcity, creativity could transform the simplest pantry items into something warm and hopeful. Up next, we'll uncover a dessert born from almost nothing at all, the ingenious water pie. Imagine opening your pantry during the Great Depression and finding almost nothing, no fruit, no milk, not even eggs. For families craving something sweet, this could have been heartbreaking. But out of that emptiness came one of the most ingenious desserts of the era, water pie. At first glance, the name sounds almost like a joke. How could you possibly make a pie out of water? But resourceful home cooks figured out a way. They began with a basic pie crust, then filled it with a mixture of plain water, sugar, a spoonful of flour, a little butter, and, if available, a dash of vanilla. As it baked, the flour and butter worked their magic, transforming the liquid into a soft, custard-like filling that was surprisingly rich and satisfying. It wasn't a luxurious dessert, it was survival ingenuity. Families who couldn't afford fruit pies or cream pies could still place something sweet on the table, bringing a little joy to otherwise bleak days. For children especially, water pie was a treat, proof that even in times of scarcity, mothers and grandmothers could create comfort out of next to nothing. This dessert also carried an emotional weight. In the middle of hardship, sharing a slice of pie, no matter how simple, meant sharing hope. It reminded families that even when cupboards were nearly empty, there was still room for creativity and care. Though water pie eventually faded from American kitchens, its story remains a testament to the resilience of those who lived through the Depression. It wasn't about indulgence, it was about survival, resourcefulness, and the human desire to hold on to sweetness even in bitter times. Next, we'll look at another surprising creation, one that pretended to be something it wasn't, the famous mock apple pie. Few desserts are as American as apple pie, but what if you couldn't afford apples? During the Great Depression and later during World War II, that was the reality for countless families. Fresh fruit was scarce, expensive, and often rationed. Yet people still craved the comfort of apple pie, so they came up with a clever substitute, the mock apple pie. The secret ingredient? Crackers. Yes, ordinary Ritz or soda crackers. Bakers would crumble them into a pie shell, then soak them in a mixture of sugar, water, lemon juice or vinegar, and cinnamon. As the crackers softened, they absorbed the flavor of the spices and syrup, mimicking the texture and taste of baked apples. When the pie emerged from the oven, most people couldn't believe it wasn't the real thing. Mock apple pie wasn't just a kitchen trick, it was a symbol of ingenuity. Families could still gather around the table and share a dessert that felt familiar, even when money and supplies ran short. It was so popular that Nabisco printed the recipe right on the back of Ritz cracker boxes, ensuring its place in American food history. For children of that era, the memory of mock apple pie was bittersweet. On one hand, it wasn't truly apples. On the other, it was proof that even in times of war and want, families could find a way to enjoy tradition and sweetness. It carried with it a sense of normalcy, a reminder that life's little joys could survive even the hardest years. So while it may sound unusual today, mock apple pie was once the taste of resilience, showing that sometimes, creativity is the most important ingredient of all. Up next, we'll explore another Depression-era dessert that rewrote the rules, the famous Depression cake. When times were toughest, families still longed for something sweet to lift their spirits. But with staples like milk, butter, and eggs either too expensive or simply unavailable, traditional cakes were out of reach. Out of this challenge was born the Depression cake, also called wacky cake or war cake, a dessert that proved even scarcity couldn't erase the joy of baking. The recipe was ingenious. Instead of butter, cooks used oil. Instead of eggs, they relied on a mix of vinegar and baking soda, which created the lift a cake needs. Milk was replaced with water, and cocoa or spices were added for flavor. Sometimes a handful of raisins or nuts found their way in, if a family was lucky enough to have them. The result was a moist, rich cake that required none of the expensive ingredients people couldn't afford. For families, this cake was more than just food, it was morale. Birthdays, holidays, and Sunday gatherings could still be celebrated with a slice of something special. Children especially cherished it, remembering how mothers or grandmothers would whip up this simple cake from a nearly bare pantry. The Depression cake also carried forward into World War II, when rationing once again forced cooks to get creative. It became a symbol of resourcefulness, proving that desserts didn't need luxury ingredients to be delicious. In fact, many who grew up with it continued to bake it long after hard times had passed, keeping the recipe alive as a memory of resilience. In a world where we expect abundance, the Depression cake is a reminder of how little it takes to create joy. With nothing more than flour, sugar, water, and courage, families baked hope into every bite. Next, we'll turn to a wartime classic, the comforting American goulash. As World War II reshaped daily life, American kitchens felt the pinch of rationing. Meat, butter, and canned goods were strictly limited, forcing families to stretch every bite. Out of this challenge came a dish that still lingers in memory today, American goulash, sometimes called American chop suey. This wasn't the paprika-rich Hungarian goulash, it was a uniquely American creation. Housewives would boil up a pot of elbow macaroni, stir in canned tomatoes, onions, and whatever bits of ground beef or leftover meat they could spare. Some versions included a splash of vinegar or Worcestershire sauce, while others leaned on salt and pepper alone. The result was a tomato-rich pasta stew that was hearty, filling, and cheap enough to feed a large family with minimal meat. What made American goulash so beloved wasn't just the flavor, it was the comfort it brought. In the uncertainty of wartime, a big steaming pot of this dish meant warmth, stability, and a full belly. It was a meal that stretched across classes, showing up in city apartments, farmhouses, and even school cafeterias. For many children of the 1940s, this dish became one of their strongest food memories. The smell of tomatoes simmering with pasta reminded them of family dinners where everyone gathered despite blackouts, shortages, and the anxiety of loved ones overseas. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable, a symbol of endurance on the home front. Even today, some families still cook it the way their grandparents did, serving it as both comfort food and a quiet nod to history. American goulash is proof that when times get tough, the simplest ingredients can still create a meal that feels like home. Next, we'll step into the Victory Garden and explore the humble but powerful Victory Garden vegetable soup. When money was tight and cupboards were nearly bare, one meal that never failed American families was oatmeal. But during the Great Depression, oatmeal wasn't just a breakfast, it was survival food. Cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable, it became the canvas for creativity in kitchens that had little else to work with. Oats could be bought in bulk for pennies, making them one of the most economical staples. But plain oatmeal wasn't always appealing, especially when it appeared on the table morning after morning. That's when families learned to add their own twists. If there was a spoonful of molasses, a handful of raisins, or even leftover apple peelings, they'd be stirred in to transform a simple bowl into something comforting. Some even stretched their oats with a bit of cornmeal or rice, turning one serving into two. In many homes, oatmeal wasn't limited to breakfast. Cold, leftover oats were shaped into patties and fried, creating a kind of makeshift oat cake. Sweetened with syrup when possible or eaten plain, these oat patties carried families through long workdays. For children, even a drizzle of milk, or water when milk was scarce, made the bowl feel special. This wasn't just about food, it was about dignity. Parents worked hard to make mealtime feel normal, even when they were serving the same dish for days. A warm bowl of oatmeal, dressed up with whatever the pantry could spare, gave a sense of comfort in uncertain times. Next time you see oats sitting quietly on your shelf, remember, for your grandparents, that humble grain was a lifeline. It wasn't just survival, it was ingenuity, resilience, and love, all stirred together in a single pot. When the cupboards grew thin and the paychecks stopped coming, bean soup became the backbone of survival for countless American families. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hearty, filling, and most importantly, cheap. During the Great Depression, a single bag of dried beans, bought for just a few cents, could stretch across an entire week, feeding hungry families with warmth and comfort. This soup was rarely the same from one home to the next. Some families simmered beans slowly with onions, carrots, or celery if they had them. Others flavored the pot with nothing more than salt and pepper. When times were especially rough, even a ham bone stripped of its meat was dropped in, giving the broth a smoky depth that carried through every spoonful. For those lucky enough to have access to garden vegetables, beans mingled with potatoes or cabbage, transforming scraps into nourishment. It wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual. Mothers and grandmothers would soak the beans overnight, knowing that in the morning, the pot would bubble on the stove all day, filling the house with a smell that reminded everyone they'd make it through another night. Children came home from school to bowls of steaming bean soup, paired with cornbread if they were fortunate, or just a slice of dry bread when they weren't. In those lean years, bean soup represented more than sustenance, it symbolized resilience. It was proof that with patience, a little heat, and a lot of love, even the humblest ingredients could bring a family together around the table. So the next time you ladle beans into a pot, remember, for your grandparents, this was more than soup. It was hope, simmered slowly through hardship. In the hardest years of the Depression, nothing went to waste, especially potatoes. They were cheap, filling, and versatile, and families learned to stretch them in countless ways. One of the most beloved solutions was potato pancakes, a dish that turned the most ordinary ingredient into something golden, crispy, and comforting. Potato pancakes were born from necessity. Housewives would grate raw potatoes, mix them with flour, eggs if they had them, and a pinch of salt. Then, with a bit of oil or bacon drippings in a hot pan, they fried the mixture into crisp, sizzling patties. The result was humble but satisfying, crispy edges, tender centers, and a flavor that felt richer than the ingredients suggested. Some families topped them with applesauce, while others used sour cream or even just a sprinkle of salt. When meat was scarce, potato pancakes stood in as the main dish, filling bellies and quieting hunger. If there were leftovers, they were reheated the next morning for breakfast, often alongside weak coffee or a glass of milk if it was available. But beyond sustenance, potato pancakes carried a quiet sense of joy. Kids loved them because they felt like a treat, golden and crunchy, a break from the endless soups and stews of lean times. Parents loved them because they stretched a single sack of potatoes into meals that lasted all week. Around the table, families didn't see a plate of frugal cooking, they saw survival, resilience, and a little spark of comfort during dark days. Potato pancakes weren't just food, they were proof that even in hardship, simple ingredients could still bring warmth and smiles. So the next time you bite into one, remember, you're tasting history, fried crisp in the skillet of hard times.